in collaboration with the Cyprus Mail. This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
This week, we discover that people who've been vaccinated are less likely to transmit the coronavirus because vaccinations reduce the viral load.
It's lower and therefore transmission is minimized.
A new report on the Eastern Mediterranean aims to inform policymakers about environmental impacts.
According to the observed trends of economic development, population increase, and this have a strong impact on the emissions and also concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which is the main cause of global warming and climate change.
And where are the women in the Cyprus problem negotiating team?
We know that diverse groups come to better solutions, to better answers, and when it comes to peacekeeping and peace negotiations, we know that these diverse groups come to solutions that are sustainable.
Well, we've had another spike in cases of coronavirus just as Orthodox Easter approaches, but we've also been hearing different things coming out of the presidential palace. At the end of last week, we were told that there was a possibility that people who had received both doses of their vaccination may not any longer have to do the rapid tests every single week. And can vaccinated people pass on the virus? We need to know exactly where we stand. So I've invited back to the programme molecular virologist Peter Karayannis from the University of Nicosia. Peter, let's start, if we may, by exactly what the vaccination does in terms of transmission, and even though people may still catch it, does it mean it won't be as serious?
Yes, from the clinical trials of phase 3, which is the last stage before licensing, we know that at least the mRNA vaccines are about 95% effective. What do we mean by that? We mean that in the trials, the remainder 5%, when they were exposed to the virus, they became positive, but they did not really become sick. In the case of the AstraZeneca, that is about 12%. So these are people who are fully vaccinated, yet when they are exposed to the virus, they contract the disease. They do not show the severe symptoms, and we know now from more recent papers that these people, although they replicate the virus, in other words, multiply the virus, they do so at low levels. So they are not as infectious as one would expect.
So the viral load is lower, basically, is that right?
It's lower, and therefore transmission is minimized.
So what of that suggestion that the people, and there's quite a considerable number now of people who've received both doses of the vaccine, so what about the fact that they still are being asked to do these rapid tests every single week?
The reason for doing so is just in case they become exposed, and then they can operate as asymptomatic carriers. Now that we know that although it may happen, transmission is extremely low, hence the suggestion by the government that these people, once they have completed 15 days after the second vaccination, and therefore they are regarded as fully vaccinated, they can be exempted from the weekly quick tests if that is what is required of them. And in addition, if they happen to be close contacts of a positive case, once they've been tested and they're shown to be negative, then they do not have to stay in self-confinement for a fortnight.
Which brings us as well to the confusion surrounding visitors to the island, because, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought we said at least a month ago that anybody who'd had both vaccinations would be welcome on the island.
Yes, that is still the case, particularly from Israel and the UK. people who have been fully vaccinated, they can visit the island, as well as people who have not been vaccinated, but they can produce a negative molecular test for the virus.
So why is it that people living already in Cyprus are not allowed to go and stay at hotels?
You know, the Cypriot custom of segregating is just to prevent at this stage, when we have such a high prevalence of the virus in the community, from the gatherings that particularly at this time of the year, during Easter, when families get together, we are trying to put people off sort of gathering in large groups in an attempt to contain viruses spread.
But Peter, come on, let's be sensible and talk about, if I go for a weekend to a hotel on the coast, I'm not likely to be in a group of 10, and I'm allowed to have 10 in my home over Easter, I believe.
Yes.
So it, again, doesn't seem to be making sense.
I know it doesn't. I personally suggested that the hotels open because I regard the places as being safe, because all the safety measures are applied and adhered to.
Let me just clarify this. Am I right that I'm allowed to go, now that the restaurants are open, to eat in a hotel restaurant,
Yes,
but I'm not allowed to stay the night?
That's correct. That doesn't make sense, I know.
When are all the people making these decisions, which are, let's face it, very inconvenient and most of the time don't actually seem to be having an impact? If you can go, and we see every day reports in the press about groups of people gathering in restaurants and passing on the virus, but if you can go and do that because it's a restaurant, but you can't go and eat at a restaurant and then go upstairs to a room for 2 or 1, it's just silly.
Yes, personally, as I said, I've made my feelings felt. Hopefully on Thursday, when the Ministerial Council meet, it might be one of the things they can decide on. But I feel that as the situation stands, with the increased number of cases per day, they may be very reluctant to proceed to any more relaxations.
Well, maybe they could have a serious look at the measures that are already in place to determine whether they do or don't make sense. Let's go back, if we may, to the vaccinations. It does seem that the uptake of AstraZeneca, which for a while had a bit of a blip after the bad press it got, has changed, and people do seem to be queuing up to get their jabs. But again, we've now got, I think, to the age group, is it 49 to 50? And yet we haven't prioritised either the people who work in the hotel and restaurant industries or the people who work in supermarkets, who are in closed spaces for considerable number of hours, so therefore presumably if there are carriers there the viral load is quite large and they're in contact with a lot of people daily. Isn't it time to start looking at who has the most contact and prioritising them for the next set of vaccines?
So that has already happened. It's something which, once again, I raised 2 weeks ago at one of our usual meetings with Mrs. Kalakuta, who is responsible for the vaccine program. And in fact, I said at that time that we should prioritize people, exactly as you said, who come in contact with lots of people during their work. And these may be taxi drivers, bus drivers, at the airport, the ports, it could be the policemen, it could be the army, it could be the teachers, lecturers, and what have you. So all these groups have been put down, and in fact, because of the sort of extra AstraZeneca vaccines which may remain after an age group opens, these are offered now on what they call by choice to people who opt to have it. And so far, in fact, today they've started with the workers at the airports and ports, and they will proceed with the other groups as and when vaccines become available. I know that from next week we are receiving, until the end of May, nearly 220, I think, doses of the vaccine.
And how far are we from herd immunity and, let's say, 75% of the population being done?
So far, up until 3 days ago, we had 220,000 vaccinated people, even with the first dose. The second dose, nearly 60,000. And of course, as you said, the AstraZeneca ones, a lot of the initial ones are completing the 3-month period, so they will start receiving their second vaccination. There is talk that this 12-week wait may be reduced to 8 weeks. We've talked about this last night. It's on the cards. And there will be an announcement quite soon, in which case the existing appointments may be changed.
Which, of course, makes me just ask, if originally it was said that you needed 3 months between the doses, what data is there to say that 2 months is okay?
This is data coming out of the United States, where the most recent trial of AstraZeneca was taking place, where they've showed that 8 weeks and 12 weeks did not make any difference in the antibody levels that were achieved during that period. Hence, the suggestion that we could go down to 8 weeks.
All right, well, we have to leave it there because we're out of time. Always a pleasure talking to you, Peter, and fingers crossed that the epidemiological situation improves dramatically in the coming few weeks. Thanks for joining me.
Let's hope so. Thank you.
We've talked many times on the programme about climate change and particularly what will happen in our area of the world, the Mediterranean and the Near East. The first Mediterranean assessment report, known as MAR1, has been prepared by an independent network of experts on climate and environmental change. They come under the title of MED-ECC. It was founded in 2015 and is now finished. Let's talk about the report that they've come up with and what effect, if any, it will have on us. We're joined on the programme by Professor Manfred Lang and Dr. George Zitis. So can you start, Manfred, please, by telling me a little bit more about this report? And it covers, I think, lots of different areas of climate change and environmental policy.
That is very correct, Rosie. Well, the report really covers not only climate change, it also covers environmental change. Therefore, it is a bit more comprehensive than that. Of course, there are lots of links between climate and environmental quality, or vice versa. So the scope is really quite broad, and as you mentioned, it consists really of the entire Mediterranean basin. The overall report, as you say, aims to address climate change and its impacts and tries to outline what lies in store for us for the next 2 decades if we continue along the same path as we have been for the last 20, 30 years or so.
OK, let me bring George in here, because George, I think you're an expert in climate modelling. So tell us how you use that in a situation like this to, if you like, foretell the future, I suppose.
Yes, exactly. What we're trying to do is, through modelling tools, we try to simulate the past climate evolution, and also based on some possible scenarios or pathways for the future, to also provide some estimates on how the climate in the region for particular is expected to change. And as I said, our projections are always based on scenarios. We are not sure how the societies will evolve. We are not sure about the emissions of greenhouse gases. So this is what our contribution is.
So it's sort of guesswork in a way, because of course I suppose facts on the ground are changing all the time. How often do you have to remodel to account for that sort of change?
Yes, this is true. And from time to time, let's say every 3 or 4 years, we revisit this type of scenarios and pathways according to the observed trends of economic development, population increase, and this have a strong impact on the emissions and also concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which is the main cause of global warming and climate change.
Manfred, if I come back to you, the report includes a summary for policymakers, I believe. So what's in that summary, and have you got any evidence that policymakers take any notice at all of these sorts of reports?
Well, that's a good question. Well, first of all, the summary for policymakers is really intended to provide sort of concentrated and sort of very dense information to political and also economical decision makers. In other words, they should be informed as to what lies in store for us, as I mentioned earlier. And while we're not giving any sort of advice or even recommendation on policy actions, we do look at existing case studies of, say, adaptation or mitigation, as it's called. In other words, addressing the adaptation to ongoing changes, as well as possible actions that would reduce harmful emissions into the atmosphere, but also harmful effects on the environment. Now, again, the policymakers themselves should take this to heart and look at it. Now, you asked correctly, will they do that? Now, we have good indication that they will, at least to some extent. Behind the report and supporting MEDEC is the Union for the Mediterranean, as one of the European initiatives that was introduced quite some time ago by President Sarkozy of France, and has ever since evolved and involves really the countries bordering the Mediterranean Sea. They have again supported and have followed the study. In fact, in formulating summary for policymakers, they have been explicitly asked to provide comments, recommendation, or input to the report. So at least some of them have read at least parts of it. And I would suppose, given their reactions that we know, I think we can be quite certain that they have read at least the summary for policymakers. To what extent this will result in political decisions is still a different question, but I would say, given this very intense science policy dialogue, I am cautiously optimistic that this will take place to some extent.
George, coming back to you, I think the report was actually put together and written, indeed, by almost 200 scientists all across the world. Now, did you all work separately, or were you, in your particular fields, coordinating with one or two other people working in the same field, maybe at the other side of the globe?
The case is that we have split the group in some groups, let's say, according to our expertise. I was mainly contributing in the climate drivers chapter. Yes, in this chapter we have discussed the physical basis of climate change, so how the climate will change in the future, and we provided input to the rest of the chapters. Of course, there were a lot of interactions with the other groups, and so yes, it's a collaborative effort, but we have mostly contributed according to our expertise.
Manfred, where do you go from here? You've presented the report. It will be read, I suppose, as you say, by all these policymakers. Is there a follow-up?
Yes, there is. In fact, a few days ago, we had a meeting of the Scientific Steering Committee, and we decided, for one thing, that there will be a MAR 2, but that will be a few years off. We're not going to do this every year. In the interim, we will work on special reports addressing specific burning issues. Let me give you an example. One of the special reports will look at coastal processes, having in mind and looking particularly at the issue of sea level rise, which, as most people know, will affect some countries tremendously. For instance, Egypt and the Nile Delta, which will, if the projections are coming into reality, will be flooded to a large extent. Another example is a report that will deal with climate change and human migration. So addressing a very, well, I could say hot topic in a sense. And a third one will look at the interaction between energy, water, food, and environment, the so-called energy, food, water, environment nexus. So we will not be idle. We will in fact be quite busy in the next 2 years, that's the time frame, in working on these special reports. And at the same time, we'll start preparing for MAR 2, which, as I mentioned earlier, is likely to appear, let's say, in 5 years' time or 4 years' time.
You mentioned migration, and of course then we think of things like, as you said, food poverty, for example. If the desertification continues, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, that is going to have a huge impact. How much do policymakers in other areas of the world bear these things in mind? Because, as you say, migration's a very hot topic, but it's only going to get very much more widespread if people cannot live where they were born.
Well, with these reports, we address issues that are discussed with our colleagues from the Union of the Mediterranean. We're also talking to the United Nations Environment Program and people who are involved in dealing with the Mediterranean. So we are looking at the wider implications of, say, migration and the causes of migration. We're not going to address as far south as the sub-Saharan Africa. You're right, of course, in saying that this will have an effect on migration overall, but we're trying to concentrate more on Mediterranean or the Middle Eastern countries. But this is still, I have to say this with some caution, this still remains to be defined and scoped out. We have not done that yet.
Yeah, and George, I'm assuming as a climate modeller, you can't really separate all these different things because they all are interconnected and have an effect on each other, don't they?
This is true. There are many feedbacks in the climate system, and actually what makes us worry is that in the region there are mostly positive feedbacks. So something like a climate parameter changes, and this causes further negative impacts in the region. And this has also an impact on extreme events, and this is something that makes us worry a lot for the region. So it's not only mean climate change, but also changes in extreme events. For example, prolonged heat waves or droughts. These are all things that we have to consider very seriously.
And we're already seeing a lot of those, of course, and we haven't even talked about the changes to the weather patterns and the Gulf Stream and all the rest of that. We don't have time for that. But thank you very much indeed for joining me, Professor Manfred Lang and Dr. George Zitis, who were lead authors in that report on climate and environmental change in the Mediterranean basin, current situation and risks for the future. The first Mediterranean assessment report, and I'm sure you can find it if you look it up online. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much, Rosie.
Thank you very much.
The informal five-party meeting on the Cyprus problem in Geneva is literally days away, and a signed letter has been sent to President Anastasiadis accompanying a petition published on change.org and initiated by Associate Professors at the University of Cyprus, Alexia Panayiotou and Maria Hadjipavlou. Alexia joins us now to explain why they're demanding to know how many and the identity of the women and men who will be participating in the 5+1 meeting in Geneva. Alexia, there's been a lot on social media in Cyprus about the lack of women on the team, despite the government's constant assertions that it is including women in all sorts of processes and government. Doesn't seem to be happening, does it?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for calling us to the program. It's very, very important to us to gain publicity around this cause, Rosie. It's a very important cause. I feel like on the one hand, we can't be criticizing Sofagate and at the same time, in our own country, not take gender into account and not take gender into account for what is absolutely important next week, important for the present, for the future, for all generations. So we're very pleased that the petition that we started has gained a lot of traction. So far on change.org, we have nearly 300 signatures, and we started the petition on Friday. I think this gives us an indication of how important the subject is to people, how important gender diversity is to people on this island.
Well, I have to, in a sense, disagree with you there, because you would have thought, considering that over half the population is female, that it would have had rather more signatures by now. Do you think it's that people don't like signing online petitions?
Well, that could be part of it, but also I think if we were out on the streets gathering signatures like the old times, indeed we would have more. Nonetheless, I think that this is a very important issue for people right now. And I can say why I think it's important from the academic perspective. We know that diverse groups come to better solutions, to better answers, and when it comes to peacekeeping and peace negotiations, we know that these diverse groups come to solutions that are sustainable and solutions that the public is more easily persuaded to adopt.
Well, there is a lot of information out there, and a lot of studies have been done about the fact that any peace negotiation that involves women is likely to be much more successful and more sustainable. And there are even Security Council resolutions about including women and gender equality on these sort of things. So have you been given any reason by the government as to why there is, I think, am I right in thinking there's only one woman on the negotiating team? And it seems extraordinary that Erato Kozakou Markouli, who was for years our foreign minister and on the negotiating team, was rather unceremoniously dropped from this meeting.
Yes, I'm not sure what the reasons are for that. I believe the government should be able to reply to this question as to why Ms. Markouli will not be present. From what I understand, the name, anyway, that has circulated, and I'm not sure if they're definitive also at this point, is that there is one woman, Christina Ioannou, who seems to be part of the extended, not the close group that is following the president to the negotiations. But again, I mean, this is all that we've read in the press. I'm not sure how definitive everything is.
So what's the next step?
Well, our goal for doing this is to apply pressure to the government. This is the reason that we're asking this question. So hopefully the government is going to pay attention. I think there are many, many qualified women that can go with the president, be part of his close circle. You mentioned one. So I'm hoping that in paying attention, our government will rethink these initial names and accept the fact that not only do we have the UN resolution that you mentioned, but we have so many studies in organizations where I teach, political science, international relations, sociology. We have so many academic studies showing that these diverse groups, especially in regards to gender, do a much better job. There is actually a phenomenon in organization studies called groupthink that tells us that when you have very close-knit, homogeneous groups that are acting under pressure in critical moments, they tend to make very big mistakes, to take very risky decisions. So what is the way around it? You make sure that you have multiple voices, multiple perspectives, diverse groups. Women bring that to the table. And what I would also want to say is that a lot of the issues that we're discussing are also gender issues. We cannot be talking about security and sustainability and the sharing of power without involving women in these discussions. These are gender issues to a very large extent.
And the government is well aware of that. I've been to so many meetings over the last 10 years or so that discuss these very things, and yet it seems that the blinkers have gone on. And I do wonder whether or not the government might come back and say to you, well, we can't change the team now because it's only a few days away and they haven't been briefed.
Well, I think what we can hope for is that they will look into it. And if this is the beginning of the talks, then it's something that should be taken into account for down the line. And I'm of the hopeful that there is down the line.
Alexia Panayiotou from the University of Cyprus, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Rosie. Thank you for this.
Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.